Welcome to Moving Medicine Forward, a podcast presented by CTI Clinical Trial and Consulting Services. This podcast is centered on advancements in healthcare and elevating individual stories and their expertise. I'm your host, Jeremy Schran, and together with my co-host, Raina Graham,
hello,
we will take you through a deep dive of CTI, clinical research, the patient journey, and much more. Today's focus is transplant. Up first, with their 60-plus years of combined experience in transplantation research, our CEO Tim Schroeder and CTI board member Dr. Bill Fitzsimmons give us insights in this specialized therapeutic focus area. For the second segment, we speak with CTI Medical Director Dr. Robert Gatson about his experience in kidney transplantation research. Tim and Bill, welcome in to the podcast today. We're talking about transplant today, and it's very important to CTI. Can you give a little background of how CTI got involved in transplantation research?
So collectively, Bill and I have more than 60 years in transplantation research, 50 on his side and 10 on my side. No, I think when you think of CTI, I think you probably want to think in terms of both personal and professional histories of Bill and I. We both were in a very unique situation where we started working in this field before transplantation was standard of care. It was really experimental or investigational if you go back 30 plus years ago. Kidney transplant was being done at some centers around the world with relatively poor results till the first approval of the modern era of transplantation, cyclosporin occurred. And then, of course, the results got significantly better when tacrolimus program that Bill led the discovery on got approved. But I think having a bird's eye view of seeing it go from being experimental to a treatment of choice, seeing heart transplants and liver transplants go from literally having maybe a 1 in 4 survival at a year to more like an 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 was pretty remarkable. So in my case, I saw it from the academic side, then the biotech side, and having seen it from those two sides, we were struck 25 years ago that there was no CRO in the world that focused on transplant or immunology. Through encouragement of people like Bill and others, we started CTI with the idea we would be a leader in transplant research. And if you fast forward a quarter century later, we feel like that still is absolutely true today. Is virtually every transplant approved treatment, whether it's a therapy, a diagnostic, a preservation, CTI has had some role, and or the personnel here at CTI have been investigators and or sponsors or part of the CRO that's been part of those approvals. Now, the interesting thing is we've also had many that have failed, or we have many that are currently in development. It's almost a new era of transplantation with things like gene-edited organs and things like new emphasis on antibody-mediated rejection, delayed graft function, et cetera. But I'll let Bill continue with the story and tell his specific view, because he obviously has been front row for many of the exciting breakthroughs.
From my perspective, the technologies in transplantation in some ways haven't changed enough or fast enough that we're not satisfied. So we're trying to stimulate more innovation in this area. But what you see and what I've seen over the decades that we've been involved in this is really it's shifted from a focus that was on chronic oral therapies for immunosuppression to now we're hearing about, of course, xenotransplantation in the news all the time. Are pig organs going to be the answer? Machine perfusion from the device perspective in terms of trying to take organs that might be discarded, because about 20% of our kidneys that are donated now are discarded, actually. Livers as well that are fatty. So we have better technologies from machine reperfusion and a lot of the other new therapies to impact the immune response are either cellular therapies, trying to work on what we call the suppressor cells, or trying to induce what we would call tolerance, meaning can we create an environment where you wouldn't reject this organ, which is a big challenge, because if you imagine your body's set up, you put a big chunk of tissue in, right, a kidney or a liver, your body's set up to get rid of that, right? And that continues for your whole life. So we're seeing those types of technologies come forward. From my perspective, in transplantation, we have to do two things. One, increase the input, meaning more organs, because right now, today, we have about 90,000 people in the U.S. on the kidney transplant waiting list. And they can wait for years, literally 3 to 5 years easily for a deceased donor kidney. So we have to increase the number of organs going in, right? And there's two ways to do that, I think, that are one in the short term, one in the longer term. Short term is machine perfusion, reperfusion, and better use of those organs that we would discard right now. So use the human organs we have in a more efficient way. That's number one. Two, get non-human organs in the long term. That's the xeno. Those are both the input. And then on the output, we have to say that the organs that we put in don't fail. Right? Because right now, 49% of deceased donor kidneys in 10 years will fail. So we're losing half of them in 10 years. Well, if you're 50 years old and you get a kidney transplant, you don't want to be back on dialysis when you're 60. Right? But that's a 50-50 chance today. We need to do a better job. So increase the input, decrease the output. That's our key.
And while it's not the subject of today's discussion, I think the other thing would be anything we can do to prevent organ failure obviously decreases the denominator. So if you think of hepatitis C being an example, when the cure for hepatitis C was developed, we were able to, once the positive HCV patients moved through the system and their livers failed and they received liver transplants, the newest generation of people are treated with HCV therapy, in most cases early, and they never fail. So one of the things that I think we're very optimistic at CTI because of our vision into nephrology, hepatology, cardiology, et cetera, is some of the patients that would have advanced to end-stage organ failure requiring a transplant, we may ultimately actually be able to, through a gene treatment or a cell treatment, actually cure or dramatically slow the progression of those diseases so that ultimately the number of end-stage organ failed patients will be less. Couple that with the two strategies Bill talked about, and you get optimism for both the short and the long term.
You kind of hit on it there about how much it's changed over the years, but what are some of the biggest changes that have happened from transplant in all your years of experience in transplant research?
Well, I think Tim touched on the immunosuppressants. Cyclosporin in 1983, tacrolimus in 1994 really made transplants possible on a larger scale. Right? So I think those are two keys. And then I think that if you look at the numbers, last year there were 27,000 kidney transplants in the US, 10,000 liver transplants. That's mind-boggling to those of us who were around in the days when we were talking about hundreds to single-digit thousands. It's now big. We have centers like Mayo Clinic in Arizona that are performing 500 kidney transplants a year. Wow. I mean, imagine you're in the Mayo Clinic in Arizona and there's basically 2 a day almost going on. That it kind of blows our mind for those, at least I think for the old guys who think, oh yeah, it would be 1 a week or something at some of the centers. Now they're doing 2 a day.
Wow. We always had a running joke that what was considered an old donor or an old recipient 25 years ago was 45 or 50 or 55 because that was the age of the surgeons. As the surgeons got older, the perspective of what's old maybe changed in their mind, plus our results got better and technologies improved, et cetera. But I think to Bill's point, a couple of things that you've seen is that increase in donors. In order to do that number of transplants he mentioned, you had to have more donors. Obviously, the kidney setting, we're able to effectively, at least in this country, do living donation. That's not the case other places around the world in a similar way. But I think in the deceased donor setting, what we've seen is the use of what we would say are either expanded donation or marginal donor, which is the less appreciated term. But these are older donors. These are donors where the organs may not be optimal. Might be that they were infected with certain viruses. It might be that they were hemodynamically unstable, et cetera. So we're using organs that previously were discarded. And probably the one that has the biggest impact in the last 10 years is the opiate overdoses. Those were largely not utilized as organ donors prior than 10 or 15 years ago. Now those are very commonly used, and they've resulted in a large increase. Bad news, we're losing people in society, especially young people, opiate overdoses. Good news is we're at least utilizing the organs from those to help other people. But I think we've seen some pretty significant changes relative to the criteria for both donors and recipients. It's not unusual. I have a chance to visit, a fair number of centers, and you can go into centers where they're routinely doing transplants in 70, 75-year-olds and getting great results. And obviously, if life expectancy is another 10 or 15 or 20 years, especially if you have a living donor, as long as you're in a physical condition to tolerate both the surgery and the post-op immunosuppression, et cetera, the boundaries are quite wide compared to where they used to be.
How does CTI utilize its experience and expertise in transplant to help a sponsor client?
Yeah, I think that's probably a question you would address on multiple levels. The first thing is at the earliest stages to provide consultative advice to a pharmaceutical or biotech company about what they're trying to accomplish. Are they likely to be successful? What kind of preclinical information or manufacturing processes are they going to have to go through? What kind of regulatory interactions with the authorities like FDA or EMA need to be there? Once you get to a place of, yes, you can move into the clinic and do a study, is how do you develop a protocol that actually is executable, meaning it's representative of the patient population, and it also is trying to address a problem as opposed to duplicating. One of the things we have is we have lots of sponsors who want to do low risk patient trials. Well, those patients do pretty well. Do we really need treatments in that group, or should we try to encourage them to moderate or higher risk? I think that's important. I think the other guidance is, can we address where's the place to go? What geographies, which countries? And once you decide on countries, which investigators or sites should you be at? And then obviously the issue of being able to go through the process in the shortest period of time, and to Bill's comments earlier, relative to a cost-effective approach, because time is money. And ultimately you want to have as many of your subjects valuable, being useful from a data management and statistical analysis perspective. So I would say each of those stages, because of the CTI experience, which is several hundred transplant studies, both solid organ, bone marrow, and hematopoietic stem cells transplant studies, is broad. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned, that you can bring forward, and not have the sponsor have a learning curve that's quite as sharp as it might have been without us.
So you talked about earlier a common theme was collaboration. We kind of talked about it just now. Are you working with organ procurement and advocacy groups to help advance, understanding of where patients are and the best way to make sure that you're utilizing organs that are coming in to the best ability?
I think that's a really important question, and I'll ask Bill to make some comments. But I think the short answer to it is yes. I think for us not to do that, I think it's a moral responsibility, and it's also a business opportunity. But if you look at it from a CTI perspective, collaborating with societies, American Society of Transplant, or American Society of Transplant Surgeons, or the International Transplantation Society, or collaborating with working groups of FDA or EMA, and Bill's been particularly at a leadership role trying to develop and validate what's going to become a very useful endpoint, as a perfect example of how all the stakeholders, I would say, have an opportunity to potentially influence things. But maybe Bill, you want to speak to IBOC just as an example, or any place else you want to go with that question?
Sure. Yeah, I think from the organ perspective, it's really the field that's working on it, and we try to support the societies that are doing that. But from the drug development perspective, as I mentioned previously, the long-term outcomes are really our big need, right? That's what patients are saying is, I want this organ to last longer, and I want to be on a safe and tolerable regimen to do that. But we can't wait and do 10-year trials. And so that's the problem. So what we're trying to do is advance the idea of surrogate endpoints that we can use for regulatory approval now, that we know are predictive of those long-term outcomes. That way we incentivize companies to go into this field potentially with accelerated approval approaches, and then we can get approval, have a therapy out there, and then monitor the performance long-term in those studies, but not wait 10 years to get an innovative therapy. So biomarkers are important, but I think the real potential for surrogate endpoints hasn't been tapped into in transplant the way it has in oncology. You see what accelerated approval, what surrogate endpoints have done in oncology. It's amazing. It's even doing it in IgA nephropathy now. We can do that in transplantation, and I think we're on the verge of doing it.
Thank you, Tim and Bill, for being on the podcast today and taking the time to lend us your expertise and fill us in on the world of transplant.
You're welcome.
We're happy to be here. And thank you for all you do to help move medicine forward.
That's what it's all about. It's our pleasure.
Let's move to segment 2 with CTI Medical Director Dr. Robert Gatson.
Dr. Gatson, we wanted to start off by just hearing your background. How did you get into transplantation, and what has your career path been over the past several decades?
Well, it's been a very rewarding experience, one that I could never have visualized on the front end. I chose to train in internal medicine and for a variety of reasons. And then once having made that choice, then I became very interested in kidneys and kidney disease. And it was in that training period that I became interested in transplantation. And at that time, there were not a lot of transplant nephrologists in the world. Nowadays, there are considerably more. So there was no point at which I said, say in medical school or anything like that, I want to be a transplant nephrologist. It was one thing led to another that led from nephrology into transplantation. And making that move was the best decision of my career, because I've thoroughly enjoyed involvement, not just with kidney transplant patients, but with recipients of all solid organ transplants. And there are certainly many commonalities between kidney and the other organs, but there are also many differences as well. So that I by no means would sell myself as an expert in all solid organ. My expertise is really in kidney transplantation, but in gaining that, it brought me into contact with heart, lung, liver, pancreas, and so on.
Great. Well, we spoke with Bill Fitzsimmons on the CTI board, and then Tim Schroeder, the CEO of CTI. They were mentioning there's 90,000 individuals on the transplant list, and they can often be on there for anywhere from 6 months to a year to 3 years even. What are some of the criteria to be on the organ transplantation waiting list?
And it again varies from organ to organ, and kidney transplantation is very influenced by the relationship with another alternative treatment for patients with end-stage kidney disease, which is chronic dialysis. Similar approaches don't exist for heart, liver, lung, and so on, so that for those patients to be on the waiting list, they typically are placed on the list when other medical management no longer is effective, so they're very sick. Kidney, on the other hand, is because of the availability of dialysis, patients are considered suitable for kidney transplant when they're as stable as possible on dialysis. And the good part is that allows time for selection and availability of the best organ. The bad part is that the list can be very long, and patients can spend many years on the waiting list. It's very unusual to spend years on a heart, lung, or liver waiting list, but in kidney, it's pretty much the norm. So the other thing that's different in kidney is that we have, because the kidney's a paired organ, we each have two. It's possible to utilize living donors, in which there is no wait. The living donor transplant can be done when it's optimal for the recipient and when it is convenient for the donor in that sense. So that access to the waiting list for kidney recipients really is built around timing. I'm not saying that very well. Is built around requirements for dialysis. I can say that.
So how successful are these organ transplants? And how many people usually have that dreaded organ rejection?
Well, they're highly successful. And I guess over my career, which spans back to the late 80s and early 90s, I've seen numerous advances. It's been my pleasure in my clinical research career to be involved in development of many therapies for transplant recipients that are now utilized globally in virtually every patient. So the success rate varies by organ. In kidneys, it's at 1 year, it's well over 90%. I would say about 95% if you include both organs from both deceased donors and living donors. With heart and liver, it's not far behind that. The issue with all solid organ transplants is that for one reason or another, the organs don't last as long as they should. And at least part of that is due to the requirement for immunosuppression. We talk nowadays about rejection in terms of episodes of rejection. And usually, if rejection is recognized early enough, it can be treated properly and reversed. So that I think that's become a big part of management of these patients is early recognition of rejection when it happens, proper management, and then doing everything possible to make the organs last as long as possible.
Yeah, you mentioned your involvement in some of the research and the treatment that is helping progress transplantation. How are clinical trials for transplantation helping combat organ rejection, and what's CTI's role in that?
Well, CTI, I think, almost from the beginning played a role in that. In fact, most people know, but not everyone, that the T in CTI stands for transplant, and the acronym became the name of the company as the company moved into other areas. Now, almost 25 years ago, in that sense. But CTI has always has its first focus on transplant, and it was gratifying to me before I came to CTI and after I came to CTI to see the esteem with which CTI is looked at by the transplant community. I've heard in casual conversation with people that don't know who I am or who I work with that advise a various sponsor of a new therapy that if they want to do their study as effectively as possible in the transplant space, they should contact CTI. And I think in general, the transplant centers and so on enjoy CTI because that's our focus. We know what the issues are. We know what the issues are with the investigators, with the patients, with the centers, the costs, the alternatives, the options. We pretty much know transplant through and through. And so CTI came along sort of after some of the major advances that we have now, but certainly CTI has played a role with most of the new therapies that have been approved in transplantation since its inception 25 years ago. And we remain actively involved in new therapies. And I'm very optimistic that some of those new therapies will exist or will come to market with the possibility of helping transplant patients even more than what we have now available to us.
How does immunology play a key role in transplantation?
It's the relationship between transplant and immunology is a very interesting one in which it's been mutually beneficial. So that transplant has been the clinical setting in which many immunologic theories and observations have been tested in humans or been described in humans. And one has the idea that the immunologists or the scientists sit down and work out either in the lab or in their heads what's happening from an immunologic perspective when an organ from one person is placed or from an animal is placed into a human recipient. And that's not the case at all. That much of immunologic development was really fueled by clinical observation in taking care of patients. And then in turn, the knowledge gained from immunologic investigation has helped inform clinical management of the patients. So really immunology and transplant are integrated, they're joined at the hip, I guess you would say, and continue to grow in tandem. Now, a day, and one of the things that you can see that's in the press now is really derived from the realization of a few years back that advances in xenotransplantation that is using modified animal organs to replace diseased organs in humans, that had gone about as far as it could go in the laboratory, and that doing it in vitro models or doing it in animal models was not going to give you the answers that you needed to move this forward in humans. And so there was almost a quantum leap to initially to test these xeno organs in a very novel fashion by putting them in deceased patients, and that a great deal was learned in that. And then now there is a compassionate use in terms of both heart and kidney that are underway in several centers across the country. And so laboratory observations begat more laboratory observations, but ultimately had to go back to the bedside to really be able to test the hypotheses and so on. And now the information gained from these early human recipients of animal organs are really being examined very closely as to how and what needs to be modified to engender long-term success. So, again, as I said earlier, immunology and transplant are joined at the hip in all sorts of ways.
Yeah, xenotransplant is a hot topic these days. What were some of the unexpected outcomes of xenotransplant, and then maybe some of the unexpected challenges of that?
Well, they're still evolving from day to day. I mean, it's hard to say, but I think one of the things, again, coming from my background in kidney disease and so on, is would a kidney, a modified pig kidney in a human perform the same functions that a human kidney does in a human? There was reason to think that it would. There was also some skepticism that it might not, in terms of some of the hormones that the kidney is responsible for generating. And so the early work in decedents showed that indeed the kidney filtered and did its cleansing function as one would expect. I think the jury is still out on some of the endocrine functions of the kidney in xeno. Certainly, I think that one of the observations from attempts at xenotransplantation many years ago was that there was something called hyperacute rejection. Kidneys would immediately fail, or the organs would immediately fail when placed in a human, and so that led that was poorly understood. But over a period of 20 years or so, we understand that phenomenon pretty well, and it's really been addressed with the gene edits, the gene modifications that have been done in the animal kidneys. But having gotten past that, the assumption was that the immune response of the human to the pig kidney would be fairly similar if you got past those early insults, and that has actually not proven to be the case as much as was expected. These kidneys, even if you get by that early hyperacute xeno response, they're quite capable of rejecting and so on. And then you have the added worry and burden of infections, pig-derived, porcine-derived infections in humans. And I know, and that's been well published, that in that the first heart recipient, that's ultimately what caused the heart to fail, was infection. So that again, these are being worked out day by day, and some of it in the newspapers for sure.
It's very exciting, very cool, cutting edge things. And speaking of that, give us something that you're most proud of in your career in general, or at your time at CTI.
My career in general is that I would phrase it as doing as much as I could, not only to take care of the patients for whom I was their physician, but also to advance needs of particularly kidney patients across the spectrum. And that early on talked about, or I wrote and was involved with how the waiting list should operate, how you should allocate organs. After spending several years in that, I realized that no matter how you sliced and diced it, that there were just not enough to go around, which then led into enhancing living donation for kidneys, and then ultimately to things like xeno in that sense. So that I feel like from the beginning and through my entire career, I've really approached things from approached my research and efforts to enhance the ability of someone with end-stage kidney disease to get a kidney. And that then has carried out to CTI, carried over that by working on the clinical trials I've worked on at CTI to help advance new therapies and so on. So I could not have imagined when I was making these choices in 1988 or so that this is the career I would have had. But from the young physician days all the way through the senior researcher days and now the CTI days, it's been an amazing journey. And it's one that I hope won't come to an end anytime soon.
Yeah, we are very lucky to have you on our team here at CTI. Where do you think transplant, or where do you want to see transplant go in the future? And I'm not talking next year, 5 years. I'm talking 20 years down the road. Where do you think it's going to be?
Well, I think first of all, it's especially that one would like to see go away. That as we can treat heart disease, kidney disease, liver disease more effectively, then that should reduce the need for transplantation down the road to replace that. And I think availability of transplantation over these years has really pushed or really driven advances in caring for patients with the disease in the first place. So the ability to intervene in cardiac disease, certainly Hep C and liver disease, that has been a major advance. And now you're seeing some really strong advances in kidney disease as well. So I guess, number one, I'd like it to say it'll go away because people will quit having these diseases. But given how things are, what I would like to see really is continued advances in the treatment, prevention of rejection, those kinds of things, which we're working on now. But even more so, the thing that to me is the most daunting is the waiting list and the shortage of organs. So I would like to see availability of organs. There's nowhere else in medicine where you go to the doctor, they say, well, you need a transplant, we'll put you on a list, and maybe in 3 or 4 years we'll have an organ for you. That doesn't exist anywhere else in the field. And so to have a ready supply of organs, and that's certainly the attractiveness of xenotransplantation would be if you can overcome all the hurdles, then it's something that you could just, sort of get off the shelf when the patient needs it, rather than when they are lucky enough to have an organ offered. So I would say, number one, removing the organ shortage. Number two, continuing to advance therapies so that either the drugs get better and better, or we figure out some way to not need the drugs. And perhaps those two would be related. Perhaps you could have a ready supply of organ that could be genetically tailored to the needs of each individual patient.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gatson, for sharing your expertise and coming onto our podcast and showcasing how you've helped move medicine forward.
Well, it's been a great pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with my colleagues at UAB for many years, and it's been a pleasure for 7 years now to work at CTI. I look for many more.
Thank you for listening. Please like, share, and subscribe as we continue to discover how medicine is moving forward.